Laugh came before she'd finished her sentence. It cracked across the showroom floor like a dropped glass, sharp and deliberate. The kind of laugh a man lets loose on purpose, so the whole room turns to look. Preston Vance pressed the back of his hand to his mouth as if he were trying to hold it in, and failed, and wanted everyone to see him fail. "Ma'am." He said the word slow, tasting it. "Ma'am, I think you're looking for the bait shop. It's 2 docks down, past the fuel pumps." His eyes went to her boots. "You're tracking half the gulf across my floor." The woman standing in front of him didn't move. White rubber deck boots, still dark with marsh mud around the soles. A canvas work jacket gone soft and pale at the elbows. Hands that looked like they'd been used for something, cracked across the knuckles, a thin white scar running the length of one thumb. She smelled faintly of brine and diesel, the way a person does when they've been out on the water since before the sun came up. "I'd like to see the Aventine 130, she said. Preston blinked. Then he laughed again, softer this time, more to himself, the way you laugh at a child who tells you he's going to be an astronaut. "The Aventine," he repeated. "You know that's a $46 million boat, right?" 46. Not thousand. Million. A woman in a coral wrap dress near the champagne cart lifted her phone. A man in boat shoes elbowed his buddy and nodded toward the counter. Nobody looked away, and nobody said a word in her defense. But here's what Preston Vance didn't know. Here's what not one person standing on that gleaming marble that morning could have guessed. Before the hour was out, he would have given anything. The watch, the blazer, every ounce of the swagger he'd spent 20 years building, to reach back through time and take those words out of the air. Have you ever had someone decide, in a single glance, exactly who you are and exactly what you're worth? Have you stood there and felt the whole room agree with them? To understand what happened at Halcyon Marine that morning, you have to know where the woman in the muddy boots came from. Not the version Preston saw, not the salt stains or the cracked hands, the real one. So before we get to the part he'd trade anything to take back, let me take you back a little further. Her name was Odessa Fontaine, 46 years old, and every day of her life started in the dark. Not because of an alarm. Odessa didn't trust alarms. She woke at 4:10 because her body had learned the shape of the morning a long time ago, and it didn't need reminding. Her bedroom window faced south out over the marsh, and even before the sky went gray, she could hear the water. That low, endless breathing sound the Gulf makes against the reeds. She'd lie there for exactly 1 minute, feet still under the quilt, listening. Then she'd get up. Her boots waited by the back door where they always did. Same pair for 2 years now, the rubber cracking at the ankle, the soles worn smooth on the left from the way she braced against the boat. She never cleaned them. What would be the point? By 7, they'd be right back in the mud. Home was a low cypress house on stilts at the end of a shell road, an hour south of anywhere you'd recognize, out past Huma where the land stops being sure of itself and turns to water. Her grandfather had shucked oysters on these same leases. So had her mother, until her hands gave out. Odessa had been pulling cages off the reefs since she was 9 years old. And there were mornings even now when she could feel every one of those years in her shoulders. By 4:30 she was on the water. The skiff's motor caught on the second pull. The air smelled like salt and cut grass and the faint sweetness of diesel, and a heron lifted off a piling as she idled past, unbothered, like it had seen her 1,000 times, which it had. Most people, if they'd driven by the far edge of her property, would have seen a mess of pipes and floats and gray plastic housings bobbing in the shallows and figured it for a fish farm gone to seed. Odessa saw something else. She saw 22 patents, because that tangle of pipe wasn't a fish farm. It was the reason coastal towns from Corpus Christi to the Carolinas had drinking water when the wells went salt after a storm. Odessa had built the first version of it on her kitchen table 19 years ago. A low-energy membrane that pulled fresh water out of the sea for a fraction of what the big desalination plants burned through wrapped around a living reef structure that rebuilt the shoreline instead of tearing it up. She'd drawn the first sketch on the back of a feed invoice. Now, the design carried the name Tidewell Systems, and it was licensed to municipalities and aquaculture operations in 17 states. The licensing checks alone came in bigger every quarter than most people would see in a decade. Add the leases, the reef contracts, the mineral rights her family had held onto through 3 generations of people telling them to sell. Anokijal and Odessa Fontaine was worth somewhere north of $300 million. You would never have known it. She didn't own a dress that hadn't been rained on. She drove a 15-year-old Silverado with a cracked side mirror held together by marine tape. Every Sunday after church, she ate at the same diner in Huma. Grits, 2 eggs over medium, coffee black, and the waitress, a woman named Yolanda, who'd been there longer than the countertops, called her Miss Des and never once asked what she did. Quiet money, built in the mud, and Odessa saw no reason on earth to scrub it off for anybody. But that morning, she had business that couldn't be done from the water. For months, she'd been reading about the Aventine 130. Not for show, for work. Tidewell had reef and water projects running now in 3 separate stretches of coast, and the meetings never lined up. A permit hearing in Mobile on Tuesday, a licensing sit-down in Charleston on Wednesday, a reef survey off the Texas coast on Friday. Commercial flights meant a rental car, a night in an airport hotel, a whole day lost to somebody else's schedule. A vessel she could work from, sleep on, run the coast in. That math had started to make sense. She'd talked it over twice with Camille Ross, her CFO, a sharp, unshakable woman who'd been with Tidewell since it was 3 people and a fax machine. The money was there. The decision was made. So Odessa did the thing she always did. She didn't call ahead. She didn't bring a lawyer or a folder or a suit. She pulled the cages that needed pulling, hosed the worst of the muck off her arms, and got in the truck. Halcyon Marine Group sat at the mouth of a private marina an hour up the coast, in one of those towns where the parking lot tells you everything. Glass and white steel, 2 stories of it. Sunlight bouncing off a showroom you could see the water through. She pulled the Silverado in between a black Range Rover and a convertible the color of a lemon, and sat for a second, engine ticking, looking up at the sign. She didn't check her hair. She didn't wipe her boots. She got out, stretched the ache out of her back, and walked straight through the front doors. And the room changed. Not loud, not all at once. Just the way a room shifts when someone walks in who doesn't match the furniture. A little tightening in the air, a glance held half a second too long, 2 conversations near the coffee bar, dropping just enough in volume to notice. Odessa noticed. She always noticed. She'd been noticing rooms her whole life. The floor was pale marble, veined in gray, buffed to a shine that showed her own reflection back at her, upside down. Soft jazz drifted out of speakers you couldn't see. Somewhere a diffuser was pumping out something meant to smell like money. Cedar, maybe, and citrus. A model of the flagship revolved slowly on a lit platform in the center of the floor, and the sunlight off the harbor came through the tall windows and lay across everything like it had been paid to. Her boots left faint prints as she crossed toward the front desk, little dark half-moons of marsh on the mirror-bright stone. The young woman behind the desk looked up, blonde, head set, a smile that arrived and then flickered like a bulb loose in its socket. "Can I help you?" Her eyes went down to the boots, came back up, then cut sideways toward the sales floor, looking for somebody to take this off her hands. That's when Preston Vance came across the room. Preston moved through that showroom the way a certain kind of man moves through a place he owns without owning it. Smooth, easy, always aware of where the money was standing. 43, gym-shaped, dark hair combed back so precise it looked painted on. A linen blazer that fit like it had been tailored to him in his sleep. A heavy silver watch that caught the light every time he moved his hand, which was often. He'd been Halcyon's top broker 4 years running, And if you'd asked him his secret, he'd have told you it was relationships. It wasn't. It was profiling. Preston could put a net worth on a person inside 30 seconds of the door opening. Watch, shoes, whatever they'd parked out front. The math was automatic. He'd already run it on Odessa. Hey there. His voice came out warm. Too warm, the warmth of a hand landing on your shoulder to steer you toward the exit. You looking for somebody, Hon? No, Odessa said. I'm looking at the Aventine 130, and that's the moment I told you about. The laugh, the bait shop, the whole room turning. Preston straightened up, dabbing at his eye, milking it. You sure you're not thinking of the pontoon rentals? He held up a hand, thumb and finger an inch apart. Little fishing boat, put an outboard on it? 'Cause that's more of a weekend thing. He glanced back over his shoulder at the sales floor, at the junior brokers watching from their desks, at the couple by the champagne cart. Performing now. He'd found his audience. The Aventine starts north of 46 million, ma'am. I don't want you to waste your whole afternoon. Odessa didn't laugh, didn't flinch, didn't drop her eyes. I mean the Aventine, she said, quiet. 240-gallon fuel burn at cruise, sleeps 10, range of about 4,000 nautical miles. She let that sit there a second. I did my reading. Something moved behind Preston's face, a flicker, there and gone. Then the grin came back, wider, and he made a decision. The kind of decision that looks like nothing in the moment and turns a whole life sideways. He decided to wait her out. Tell you what, he said, the warmth sliding into something almost fatherly. Let me go grab a couple things. Sit tight. He turned and walked away. He didn't grab a single thing. He crossed the floor to a man in a navy quarter zip who'd come in a full 2 minutes after Odessa. Full handshake, big smile, a hand on the back, immediate attention, and Odessa Fontaine stood alone in the middle of a $46 million showroom. 5 minutes. The receptionist found something fascinating on her monitor. 10 minutes. Odessa walked the wall of scale models behind the glass and named every one of them in her head. 15 minutes. A man from the cleaning crew appeared near her feet with a mop and started wiping up her boot prints. Not rudely, exactly, but slow, pointed, making sure it was seen. From a desk against the far wall, a young broker named Theo Aldridge watched the whole thing and felt his stomach turn over. Theo was 26, 6 months on the job. Talent scouts, still had the shine on him, still believed the pitch they'd fed him in training about service and relationships and treating every guest like the most important person in the building. He watched the mop go over the floor, and he watched the woman just stand there, patient, hands loose at her sides, and something about it made him get up out of his chair. He'd taken 2 steps when Preston's voice landed behind him. Sit down, rookie. Quiet, even, the voice of a man who's never once had to raise his volume to be obeyed. I've got this one. Theo sat, but he kept watching. Preston finally circled back around, 15 minutes of nothing behind him, wearing the expression of a man doing somebody a big favor. Still here? He tilted his head like he was surprised. All right, help me out. What is it you do? I work the water, Odessa said. Oysters, reef work. Preston nodded slow, lips pressed together, and the amusement crept back into his face like a stain spreading through a napkin. Oysters, he said it the way you repeat a punchline. Sure, okay. He put his hand on her shoulder, friendly looking, but it was steering, and it started walking her away from the flagship model, toward the far corner of the floor, the used tender section, the little stuff, the place he put people he'd already decided not to take seriously. Let me show you something a little more in your world. Got some real nice center consoles down here. Perfect for running your traps, whatever you got going on out there in the... Odessa stopped walking. His hand slid off her shoulder. I didn't come for a center console, she said, level, controlled. The voice of a woman who'd spent a lifetime picking her words, like she was picking through shells for the whole ones. I came for the Aventine. I'd like to see the spec sheet, talk through the layout, and hear about delivery. The grin thinned. What came up underneath it was harder. Irritation. Odessa wasn't following the script. She was supposed to be embarrassed by now. She was supposed to be gone. "Here's the thing," Preston said, and crossed his arms. "Before I pull anything up on a boat like that, I'm going to need proof of funds. Bank letter, asset statement, something from your financial guy. Standard procedure." "Is it?" Odessa said. "Not really a question. You ask everybody who walks in here for that, before you'll show them a boat? It's policy." It was not policy. Theo Aldridge knew for a fact it wasn't policy, because he'd watched Preston hand full spec sheets to walk-ins a dozen times without so much as a name, as long as those walk-ins wore the right watch, drove the right thing, had the right look about them. "I'd like to speak to your manager," Odessa said. Preston waved a hand, loose and lazy, like he was shooing off a gnat. "I'm the guy you talk to. Roland backs me on it." He tipped his head toward a heavy-set man in his 50s standing near the glass, reading glasses low on his nose, tablet in hand. Roland Pike, the floor director. Roland gave a slow nod without looking up from the screen, which was its own kind of permission. A wall, polite on the surface, brick underneath. And this is where it got ugly, because men like Preston Vance don't just turn a person away. They need that person to feel the door lock behind them. It isn't enough to say no. They have to make sure you understand you were never welcome to begin with. He stepped in close enough that his cologne mixed with the salt still on her jacket. Two whole worlds standing in 3 feet of marble. "Let me be straight with you," he said, and the fake warmth peeled off his voice like old paint off a dock post. What was under it was cold and clean and deliberate. "I've been selling boats for 20 years. I know a buyer when one walks in. I can smell it." He let that land. "And you don't smell like a buyer. You smell like low tide. You smell like you've been standing in a marsh since 4 in the morning. His eyes went down to her boots and came back up, slow, taking their time. A full inspection, right there in front of everybody. "This floor costs more per square foot than most folks clear in a year, and you're walking mud across it like you own the place." Odessa said nothing. Her hands hung easy at her sides. She had the stillness of somebody watching a storm build out over the water, knowing it was coming, knowing exactly when, in no particular hurry about it. And then Preston did something he'd never done in 20 years on that floor. He walked over to the reception area, pulled out one of the little upholstered chairs, carried it across the marble, set it down directly in front of Odessa, and sat. Not to offer her a seat, to block her. He crossed one leg over the other, leaned back, got comfortable. A man made himself into a fence between a woman and a boat she'd come to buy. "Here's what I figure happened," he said, and his tone went almost thoughtful now, like a professor being patient with a slow student. "I figure you were driving past on your way to the co-op, saw the boats through the glass, thought it'd be a hoot to come in and play pretend for a few minutes." He smiled, thin and sharp. "And hey, no shame in it. Everybody's got a dream. But dreams don't buy Aventines, Han. Bank accounts do. And I'm looking at somebody whose bank account's got about as many zeros in it as she's got mud on her boots." Over by the champagne cart, the woman in the coral dress wasn't laughing anymore. She was watching the way you watch a wreck you can't look away from. The man with his phone still had it up, and now the little red dot said he was recording, and the guy next to him tilted the screen to see and smirked, and neither one of them put it down. Nobody said that's enough. The room had become an audience, and Preston was up on stage. Roland Pike stood 10 feet off with his arms folded, face carefully, deliberately blank. The expression of a manager who'd decided that doing nothing was the same as not being involved. It wasn't. He knew it wasn't. Odessa looked at the man sitting in the chair. She looked at the phones. She looked at a whole room full of people treating her like the afternoon's entertainment. Every face either amused or turned pointedly away. Not one person in the building willing to stand with her. Then she spoke, and each word came down like a stone set in a wall. I drove an hour to get here. I came to spend $46 million. And you won't show me a piece of paper. Preston uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, and he delivered the line that would end up playing on 3 separate news stations by the following night. Tell you what. His voice went loud now. Showroom loud, the kind that carries. Why don't you come on back when you've got something in your pocket, besides marsh mud and a big imagination? He stood up, straightened his blazer, turned toward the room with a grin, like he was waiting on applause. And he got a little. A few short, uncomfortable bursts of laughter. The sound people make when they're ashamed of themselves, but not quite ashamed enough to stop. A man by the window clapped twice, slow, like punctuation. The guy recording gave a thumbs up, and Preston caught it and winked. Theo Aldridge sat at his desk with his jaw clamped so tight his back teeth ached. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From watching a line get crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, and being told to sit down while it happened. And Odessa Fontaine stood in the middle of all of it, alone, the mud drying and cracking on her boots. She reached into her jacket. Preston's eyes tracked her hand, and for half a second, something flickered across his face. Not fear exactly, but the first cold hint that he didn't actually know one single thing about the woman in front of him. She took out her phone. Not to show them what it had been quietly recording since the moment she walked through the door. That would come later. She took it out to make a call. She dialed, put it to her ear, and stood there in the buzz of a room that was already turning back to its own conversations, the show apparently over. The line picked up on the second ring. Camille, Odessa said, same voice she'd used all morning. Level, unhurried. Like she was ordering off a diner menu. I'm up at Halcyon Marine. I'd like to move ahead on the Aventine we talked about. Go ahead and initiate the wire for the full amount. A pause. Yes, the 46. Another pause. Thank you, Camille. She hung up and slid the phone back into her jacket. Preston had caught pieces of it from across the floor. He turned his head. The grin was still there, but one corner of it had gone crooked, like a picture frame knocked off level. 46 million, huh? He called out and shook his head, chuckling to himself. But the laugh was thinner now, hollower, a joke he was mostly telling to convince himself. That's a good one. You ought to try Hollywood, sweetheart. You got the range. 2 brokers near him laughed, quieter this time. Something in the room had shifted by half a degree, the way a compass needle trembles before it swings. Odessa didn't answer. She just stood where she'd been standing for the last 20 minutes. Same spot, same posture, same unreadable calm. But Theo was watching her face, and he saw something in it he couldn't name at first. Something steady and deep and completely untouched by anything that had happened. And then he placed it. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hurt. It wasn't defeat. It was patience. The kind that comes from knowing precisely what happens next. 3 minutes passed. 3 minutes of Preston leaning back at his desk with that grin bolted on. 3 minutes of Odessa standing motionless near the front, hands in her pockets, watching the room go on without her. Then the receptionist's computer chimed, soft, the kind of sound that lands 100 times a day and means nothing. Except this time the young woman leaned in, clicked, and stopped breathing. Her lips parted, her hand came up to her mouth. She read it once, then again, then a third time, eyes going wider with every pass. She turned in her chair, and her voice came out tight and strange, almost cracking. Mr. Pike, you need to see this. Right now. Roland Pike walked over easy at first, the pace of a man expecting a scheduling snag or a vendor invoice. He leaned over her shoulder, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the screen. And the color drained out of his face in stages. The cheeks first, then the forehead, then the lips. On the screen was a letter of intent from Camille Ross, Chief Financial Officer, Tidewell Systems, LLC. A formal commitment to purchase one Aventine 130, fully configured. Attached to it, A wire authorization from a regional bank you'd recognize. The number read $46 million, and underneath it, one more line. The remaining account balance, after the transfer cleared, $268 million. Roland's knuckles went white on the edge of the desk. Preston. His voice was different now, stripped bare. Preston, come here. Preston looked up, annoyed. Roland never called him over like that. He pushed back his chair, tugged his blazer straight, and strolled over with the loose confidence of a man who did not believe there was anything left in the world that could surprise him. Roland turned the monitor. Preston looked at the screen, and his grin didn't fade. It fell. It came apart like a building losing its foundation. One floor at a time, then all at once. His jaw dropped open a full inch. His eyes ran across the numbers, then ran again, like reading them one more time might change what they said. 46 million, authorized, ready to move. Balance remaining, 268 million. His hand came up to his mouth. His fingers were trembling against his lips, and the heavy silver watch on his wrist, the one he wore like a trophy, all of a sudden looked like a toy. Roland was already typing her name into a search bar with shaking fingers. It loaded in 2 seconds. Odessa Fontaine, founder and sole owner, Tidewell Systems. 22 patents in low-energy desalination and living shoreline reef technology. Licensing agreements active in 17 states. Profiled in industry press and named to a national list of coastal innovation leaders. Estimated net worth, north of $300 million. The espresso chain had gone quiet. The man who'd been recording lowered his phone. The woman in the coral dress stood frozen with her champagne halfway to her mouth. And now the whole room understood that something had gone very, very wrong. Roland crossed the floor toward Odessa, and every step looked heavier than the one before it. When he reached her, his voice came out thin, drained of all its authority, the voice of a man who's just realized which side of history he's standing on. Mrs. Fontaine, he swallowed. Mrs. Fontaine, there's been a terrible. Can we start over? Please, let me start over. Odessa looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at Preston, standing by the desk, gone pale as the marble under his good shoes, at the young man who'd laughed, at the people who'd raised their phones, at the whole room that had watched a woman get humiliated for 20 minutes and done exactly nothing. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. Not the quiet of anger. Something worse than that. Disappointed quiet. The voice of somebody who'd walked in that morning half hoping, just this once, that it might go different. I came here to buy a boat, she said. Drove an hour, had the money ready, knew the specs cold. All I needed was for somebody to treat me like a customer. She paused, and the room was so silent you could hear the air conditioning breathing. Instead, I got laughed at, blocked with a chair, told I smelled like low tide, told to come back when I had something in my pocket. Her eyes found Preston's across the floor, and Preston couldn't hold them. He looked down, at the marble, at the dried mud prints still tracked across it, the same prints he'd mopped up, the same boots he'd laughed at. You didn't just laugh at me, Mr. Vance, Odessa said. You laughed at everybody who ever walked through a door like that one and didn't look the way you'd decided a rich person's supposed to look. She reached into her jacket. Preston flinched, a small, involuntary thing. But she only pulled out her truck keys. I won't be buying from Halcyon Marine, she said. Not today. Not ever. She turned and walked toward the doors. Each boot left one last faint print on the marble. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. The glass door swung shut behind her, and the marina light came through and lay across the floor and the prints she'd left, and for a long moment, the whole showroom just stood in it. Then it came apart. Roland Pike spun on his heel and pointed one shaking finger at Preston. His face had gone from white to a blotched, furious red. My office. Now. Preston didn't move at first. He stood by the desk with his arms hanging, staring at the front door like Odessa might come back through it and tell everybody it was a joke, that a woman in mud boots couldn't possibly have just walked away from a $46 million sale over how he'd talked to her. But the door stayed shut, and the prints stayed where they were. Preston. Now, before we get to where all of this landed, and it landed hard, I want you to sit with one thing. Everybody in that room had a moment. The receptionist had a moment. Roland had 10 of them. The people filming had 20. Any one of them could have said that's enough. Any one of them could have crossed the floor and pulled up a chair next to her instead of in front of her. Only one person even tried. Remember that. It matters for what comes next. The door to Roland's office slammed hard enough to rattle the framed sales awards on the wall, most of them with Preston's name on the little brass plates. Through the glass partition, the whole floor could see Roland pacing behind his desk, both hands going, and Preston in the chair across from him with his palms up in front of his chest, like a man trying to stop traffic. You couldn't hear the words. You didn't need to. By that evening, the video was everywhere. Not the shaky one the man by the cart had shot. That one made the rounds too, but the one that mattered was Odessa's. The one her phone had been quietly recording from the second she stepped inside, tucked in her jacket, catching all of it. The bait shop. The chair. Low tide. Come back when you've got something in your pocket. Every word, clean audio, and at the end, her own voice, level and calm, telling a room full of people what it had felt like. Tidewell's attorney sent it to Halcyon's corporate office with a letter attached. Odessa didn't want money. She had plenty, and the point was never money. What she wanted was a record, a deposition, a reason for the next person in muddy boots to get a chair pulled out beside them instead of in front of them. She got it. Halcyon Marine Group settled inside of 6 weeks, and the terms weren't quiet. The company sat for its first independent audit in its history. 19 employees went through anti-bias training that Odessa's own counsel helped design. The proof of funds before showing practice, the one Preston had sworn up and down was policy, was struck from every Halcyon location in the country in writing. The company put out a public statement admitting to systemic failures in how it treated the people who walked through its doors. It read like it had been written by lawyers because it had, and it didn't stop at Halcyon. 2 competing brokerages launched their own internal reviews before anybody asked them to. A marine industry trade group published new guidance on client treatment and cited the case by name, no names redacted. Odessa got invited to give the keynote at their annual conference. 800 people in a hotel ballroom in Miami, executives and builders and brokers, the kind of room that smelled exactly like that showroom had. Leather and ambition and expensive cologne. She walked up to the podium in her deck boots. No suit, canvas jacket, jeans. The salt still pale on her sleeves. She spoke for about 10 minutes. Quiet, no slides, no notes. Just a woman telling a room full of powerful people what it felt like to be laughed at for wanting to spend her own money in her own country. When she was done, all 800 of them stood up. The applause ran longer than the speech did. Theo Aldridge wasn't at Halcyon anymore either. Turned out the same video that ended one career put a spotlight on the one person in it who'd stood up out of his chair. A competing brokerage saw it, recognized something they said they'd been trying to hire for years, and brought him on. He made senior associate inside 4 months, fastest in the company's history. On his first day, his new manager told him something Theo would repeat for the rest of his life. You did the right thing when it cost you something. That's the only kind of right that counts. And Preston Vance. Preston got let go from Halcyon before the settlement was even signed. And here's the thing about an industry that runs on reputation. Word travels fast. No brokerage on the coast would touch him. His name had turned into the story people told in training rooms. The cautionary tale. The guy who read a woman by her boots and lost his firm $46 million and a good deal more than that. He landed, eventually, at a used boat lot off the interstate. Mid-level, straight commission, a fluorescent-lit trailer that smelled like old carpet and marina fuel. During the proceedings, Preston had been offered a chance to make a public apology. His own attorney told him to take it. Roland told him to take it. Even the trade group, desperate to move on, urged him to just say the words. He wouldn't, and that refusal followed him around like a shadow he couldn't outwalk. Into every interview, every background check, every time somebody typed his name into a search bar, there it was. The broker who laughed at a woman in muddy boots, and never once, not one single time, said he was sorry. Odessa took delivery on the Aventine that fall, from a different builder in a different state, from a broker who shook her hand at the door and meant it. She ran it down the coast herself, checked her reef sights from the water, slept aboard between meetings the way she'd planned to all along. The first morning, she took the helm. She wore the same boots. There was a faint smudge of marsh mud on the pale teak of the deck where she'd stood. She looked at it for a second. She left it there. So let me ask you something before you go. The next time somebody walks into a room where you are, somebody in the wrong clothes, the wrong boots, somebody the rest of the room has already decided about, what are you going to do? Are you going to laugh along or look at your shoes and say nothing, which is the same thing? Or are you going to be the one who gets up out of the chair? Because you never really know who just walked in. The person you're too busy to help might be the person who owns the whole marsh, and the reef under it, and the water over it, and the patience to wait while you find out the hard way.